All right, we're back. We are COMP253 in the fall 2018 semester, and that is Assets for Game Developers. We're week 8 today, and it's Intro to 3D Modeling with Blender that we're talking about. All right, so I've downloaded Blender from blender.org. So if you haven't had a chance to do that, go ahead and do that. Again, you can find that here, blender.org. What I did was I downloaded the latest build, so download Blender 2.79b. There is another version of Blender that's in alpha right now called 2.8, Blender 2.8, which is actually an awesome tool. They really made a lot of changes to it. I invite you to try that out at some point. It's not ready, and there's a lot of stuff that's happening with Blender 2.8, but they say by 2019 we'll have a beta version that's going to be pretty stable that we can start downloading. Again, this is a completely free tool, and the stuff that Blender can do, it was actually used lately to make a movie on Netflix called Next Gen. I'm not sure if you've seen it on Netflix. I can't really play it here because I'm actually recording on YouTube. So recording something of a recording, it's kind of not allowed, right? But Next Gen, if you take a look at it, is a movie that's completely done from beginning to end with Blender. All right, and this is a 3D movie that's been produced and on Netflix. Okay, so really kind of interesting. It just came out recently. All right, so what is Blender? Blender is a modeling tool. Blender is also a texturing tool. Blender is also a sculpting tool. Blender is also a game development tool. Blender is also a photorealistic modeling tool. Yeah? Huh? Oh, video age, sure. Blender is so many things. And one of the things with Blender, when you look at it the first time like this, it's like flying a plane. There are so many switches and buttons to press all over Blender, and you have no idea where to start. So let's start with navigation. First of all, let's talk about how Blender is laid out. If you notice, and before we get into what 3D modeling and all that stuff is first of all, we have to understand what's happening here. Number one, you need a 3-button mouse. You cannot use your finger with a touchpad be effectively modeling in Blender. If you have something like that, you know, I recommend getting a 3D mouse, a 3-button mouse, or you could use your pen tool at some points with your tablet. However, there's going to be a different process and workflow for that than I'm going to use my 3D or 3-button mouse. So please, if you don't have a 3-button mouse for yourself, please get one. It's required. That's the one thing I'm asking you to get. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to get anything else. I don't want you to spend any more money than you've already spent on this course, but you do need a 3-button mouse. All right, so notice my cursor here is in the middle of the screen. Okay, if I hover to the left, and it's hard to see, but basically what it is wherever my cursor is, that panel kind of lights up. If you notice this area here, as I move my cursor from one panel to the other, and notice down here is where the panel starts, that panel kind of lights up depending on where I'm moving my cursor, right? So this is an interesting observation for us because wherever I move my cursor, that is where my shortcut keys that I'm going to be talking about today are going to work. In Blender, there are several menus you're going to be able to use. But most of the things we're going to be doing in Blender is through a series of shortcut keys. This is the way we're going to work. And you're going to be like, wait, we're not even going to learn menus? No, menus for you are going to be a waste of your time. It's going to take too long to do it this way. We need to remember the shortcut key. That's why I'm recording this thing. So number one, when you notice that the scene in Blender, one thing to do before I do anything else is when it comes to selection of objects that you see in your 3D scene, in Blender, the only way you can select objects is by right-clicking, not left-clicking. Left-clicking does not select objects. What it does actually is it moves something called the 3-dimensional cursor. Take a look here. See this little object in here? If I left-click somewhere in my scene here, now I've got this little target, something that looks like a little target, and that is my 3-dimensional cursor. I can undo that if I want to, right? But one of the things we're going to have to learn how to do is in the toolbar, notice that I want to start a new scene, Control N, and it's going to hover over here. If I look away, that Control N is gone. So Control N, and then I've got to click Reload Startup File. We're going to reload the startup file a bunch of times. Okay. So what is Blender and how does it work? So notice that there is this thing that looks like a cube in the middle of my screen. If I want to zoom in, I can zoom in by using my middle mouse wheel. All right. So if I zoom in, I can scroll in and scroll out. Okay. So I can scroll in and scroll out. So zooming into the scene. But what am I really doing here? Right? What I'm really doing is I have a viewport camera. My viewport camera is the eyes that we're using to look at my scene. And right now, my viewport camera is in something called perspective mode. Okay? So I'm looking at the scene in perspective. It looks like I'm looking at a cube in three-dimensional space. But actually what's happening is I'm looking at a flat 2D surface, and the illusion is that my cube is in 3D. By the way, all 3D video games work this way. There's an illusion that we're looking at something in 3D, but actually we're looking at a 2D surface, and things are scaled and drawn with pixels that are brighter and darker to make them appear like they're 3D. So this is a thing to understand when we use a 3D modeling tool, and actually even when it comes to 3D graphics. Okay, so I zoom in. Notice that I have this thing in the middle. These three little arrows are the manipulator. This is the manipulator arm. The three arrows represent different axes on your scene, right? So the blue arm represents the Z axis. The green arm represents the Y axis, and the red arm represents the X axis. Notice, if you can't remember, on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, it shows you what each of these colors mean. Now, for those people who know a little bit about 3D graphics, this means that Blender is set up with a Z up orientation. In Unity, what is the orientation in Unity? Do you guys know? Sorry? Y up, right? This is different. So when we produce something in Blender, we're using Z up, whereas in Unity, it's Y up. In Unreal, it's Z up. In Maya, it's Y up. Okay? Every tool is going to have a different orientation. Or maybe it's not every tool, but some tools have different orientations. Notice if I want to move my object, I want to translate my object in three-dimensional space, right? And I want to move it to the right only on the Y-axis. If I click and hold and drag the little arrow, the Y arrow, I can move my object in three-dimensional space across one axis only. So if I want to move it across the Z-axis, I can move it up and down. If I want to move it across the X-axis, I can move it kind of forward and back in this particular view. And if I want to move the object in any direction at all, random directions, I can press, here's the first shortcut key, I can press the G key. If you press the G key, now I have control to move the cube that I have in any place that I want in my scene that I can see. However, depth is really challenging to do in this mode. So I can move it around, right? But I can't really do something like this without actually using an axis. Okay, if I undo, I can press Control Z, of course, to undo, right? And my undo is not working, but oops. But basically what you can do typically is undo, undo, undo. That's really weird that my undo is not working. Why isn't that happening? Yeah, wow. We have awesome capabilities. When you can't undo, that's always a bad sign. But what we can do is we can press Control N. Control N allows us to restart our file. Brings us back to the startup file. But Control Z should work for you, not for me. Okay, so let's go to the next part. Notice that I have what looks like three objects in the scene. I have this object on the left, I have this object in the middle, and I have this object way in the back, right? The object on the left is actually your camera. And it's not the camera that we're looking at the objects with. It's a camera that is going to be rendering the scene. When I say rendering, I mean drawing the scene in its final view, if you will. Okay? Right now, we're not looking through this camera. We have our own viewport camera that we're looking at. Okay? If I want to select the camera or any object, I right-click. And it gets highlighted in orange. So I right-click, I right-click, I right-click. And I can highlight these objects by right-clicking. Again, if I left-click, I move something called the three-dimensional cursor. And that's not what I want to do. All right. So that's number 1. 2. Let's just move back to, I'm just going to reset the scene back to normal. All right, so I know how to zoom in and out. I know how to move the object in three-dimensional space. Pretty simple. How about orbiting? I want to orbit around this object. So if I click the middle mouse wheel and drag it around, I can orbit around an object by middle clicking the mouse wheel and dragging. Okay, I'm orbiting around an object. Okay, are we good with this part? So again, zooming in, orbiting. Those are 2 ways we can purvey the scene. The next part is if I want to pan the scene, I'm going to press Shift and then middle mouse click, and now I can do something like this. I can pan the scene to the right and left or up and down. These are important steps. So I can zoom in, I can pan, I can orbit, okay? Which helps us maneuver and navigate around the scene. Are we good with this? Anyone not good? Put up their hand. All right. Zoom in, zoom out, right? Pan, orbit. Sometimes we call this tumbling as well. I want to tumble around the scene, right? And that's fine too. Okay, so we have our object, and we have a different thing called the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor, if I click anywhere around in my scene, if I want to add a new object, what I can do is it will appear wherever my 3D cursor is positioned in my scene. So I want to add a new object. The way I can add a new object is down here in the menus. I can go to Add, and then I can go to Mesh. This is one way of doing it. And let's say I want to add another cube. I can just click Cube, and now a new cube will appear in my scene. All right, so here I'm going to pan over. I'm going to orbit around, and you can see that I've got 2 cubes in my scene now, right? One where the 3D cursor is, and one where my other cube is. I'm going to zoom out, put the 3D cursor somewhere else, and press Add Mesh. And I want to go to Plane, and I can add a plane to the scene. So you can see that there's a plane in the scene. I want to click the 3D cursor somewhere else. I'm going to click Add Mesh, and then select a UV sphere, and now I have a sphere in the scene. You can see that there's several objects that appear to be in my scene. Are you with me? So again, this is kind of an important way of doing things. Hey, if you forget how to add any of this into your scene, and I want to do something that I don't know how to do in Blender, this is a really key thing. Press spacebar anywhere in the middle when your mouse is somewhere in the middle. So if I press spacebar and I type in Add and I space Mesh, right? So or if I type in Mesh by itself, you can see that I can transfer mesh data, I can create navigation mesh, I can check mesh surfaces. If I want to make an object, if I click on Add, it'll do Add Icosphere, Add UV Map, Add Meatball, Add Brush, Add Camera. How about adding a cube? Here we go. I want to add a cube. Let's do it. And it adds a cube right where I want. So if you forget how to do it, you can always use spacebar to kind of figure out what you want to do, even if you forgot how to do it. Okay? And also, what other things can you do? Can you do undo? Now notice my Control Z does not work, but it's actually there as something that I can do. And I got to figure out why that's not happening right now. There might be a reason for this. My computer might need to be reset. But yeah, Control Z is like a key thing. If you can't do Control Z on your machine, issues, definite issues. One thing that people like to do is right-click on their tools, right, and pull up a little context menu. There is no context menu in Blender. So if you right-click on an object, you don't get a context menu. What you get is selection. All right, selection. If I select and if I select and hold, like right-click and hold, I can move an object also in Blender. So left-click lets the object go. Right-click and hold moves the object. Left-click lets it go. Right-click and hold moves the object. Left-click lets it go, and so on. Okay. So I can position stuff in Blender and then pan around the scene. Yeah, these are basic things. We need to talk about them because without doing this stuff, you can't do anything more advanced. Let's reset the scene. So Control N to reset the scene back to the startup scene. I frequently do this, and it's sometimes better and easier to restart than to fix your problems. Okay, if I want to add an object to the scene without using my menu, and this is where I recommend, the command is Shift-A. Shift-A brings up your little menu, and you can add in a cube, or if I want to add in a, again, we're looking at this top mesh menu to do it, a cylinder. Here's a cylinder. And we're also going to add in other meshes, maybe a cone. Here's a cone shape. And if I tumble around the scene or orbit, you can see that there's a bunch of different kinds of objects. These objects that are inside the mesh menu are called primitives. Okay, primitive objects are objects we can use to build out a scene. And we can also use primitive objects to make more complex objects by using things like, or tools to put objects together into one object. These tools are called, or these operations are called Boolean operations, where I say, I want this object and this object, or I want these objects only when they intersect, or I want to remove a part of this object by using this other object to slice this object away. Boolean tools, which we'll get into. All right, so this is how we add primitives. Shift-A, you can add a primitive. You can add other things too, but please don't go down in here because there's a lot of things that you can experiment, but they may not mean anything to you right now. Okay? So right now, think about adding primitives. Okay, challenge number 1, just by adding primitives. What I want you guys to do over the next few minutes is I want you to make a wall of cubes. All right, a wall of cubes. So take your time, and what I want you to do is literally make a bunch of cubes that look like a wall. How would you do this? So a couple ways to do this. One more tool to show you is if I right-click and select a cube, and if I press Shift-D, I duplicate that cube, right? I can press Shift-D a number of times. One thing I can do is, right now I have free movement. If I want to limit my movement to only one axis, for example, the Z axis, I can press the Z key or the Z key again. So now I can duplicate my cube, left-click to let go, Shift-D on the Z axis, Shift-D on the Z axis, right? Shift-D on the Z axis. So I'm pressing Shift-D and then immediately Z afterwards. And I can create cubes inside of a line all at once. I can right-click on the cube, Shift-D, and then press the Y-axis, right, to kind of duplicate my cubes, Shift-D, and press the Y-axis to duplicate my cube on different axes to create the objects that I want in 3D space, right? Same thing with the X-axis. If I right-click on a cube, Shift-D, and then press immediately the X-axis, I can kind of duplicate along a particular axis. So that's kind of a trick that you can use to duplicate your objects. To remove objects, that's one thing you need to know as well. If you right-click and press X, the X key, it'll allow you to delete the object from the scene. So right-click, press X to delete. Right-click, press X to delete, and press left-click to accept. Okay? So left-click accepts. So I can delete objects from my scene pretty fast until I'm back to pretty much the intro scene. All right, so your task for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to keep recording, is I want you to make this wall of cubes. Okay, who's already done it? It's not that difficult to do. Huh? Make a wall of cubes, let's say, that span across the Y-axis, right? And I want them to be 2 cubes high. 2 cubes high and right around the Y-axis, right? Across. Just 2 cubes high. Let's try this out. Now, here's the thing. When you make a wall of cubes, I want the cubes to be very close to each other or touching. I want you to do this by eye. So something like this. I'm going to kind of right-click, Shift-D across the Y-axis, and then some will come down like this and just leave them close together and keep doing that across the Y-axis. There we go, and keep doing that. One thing you could do is if you want to select multiple cubes at the same time, you can Shift right-click. So if I want to click all these cubes, I have all these cubes selected. I can now click Shift-D across the y-axis, and I can have multiple cubes all at once. All right. So, and if I want to select all these cubes, I can select all of them by shift right click and holding down the shift while I'm right clicking, and then press shift D, which duplicates all those cubes. And let's put it across the z-axis this time so I can build up my wall. Right? It doesn't take long for you to do this kind of stuff. But this is the first part of navigating Blender. Blender, you need to understand how to navigate Blender inside the main viewport. So here what I said, this here where my mouse is right now, where I'm working within, is the main viewport in Blender. Okay? So I'll take a few more minutes, a couple more minutes to do it. Shouldn't take you long. Now you're going to notice some problem here. If I wanted to ask you to build a perfect wall, is this really the right thing to do? Here's the other thing. If I click a cube and if I press Shift D and then across the Z-axis and then I give it a number, okay? Like I put a number in my, after the Shift D in the X-axis or the Z-axis and I press the number 1 or 2, you can see that it'll be exactly 2 units above the other cube. Now this, not something to note is these cubes, as a hint, are 2 units by 2 units, 2 units by 2 units. That's what these cubes are, right? So if I right-click on a cube, check this out, guys. Here's a trick. Shift D to duplicate it, press the Z-axis, the Z key, and then press the number 2. I get the next cube in exactly 2 units above the other one. So it's actually stacked perfectly on top of it. Take a look. There's no separation like this. These cubes are separate. These cubes are really touching each other.
You want a perfect touch?
No, I'm just, I wanted to see what you were going to do. But notice that these cubes seem to be together, right? It's like playing Lego in 3D, right? So now we've been doing things by eye, but I want you to be able to do things numerically to be more accurate, okay? So in order for you to do that, you can bring up a numeric panel that can come up. If you're hovering your mouse, your left mouse, in the viewport, the main viewport here, only, and you press the N key, N for Norman, it'll pull up this numeric keypad right here. Here's the numeric keypad. And the numeric tab, or panel, if you will, allows you to translate an object exactly where you want it to. All right, so notice that there is 3 parts of my transform. I have my transform component for this object has location, rotation, and scale. Remember in Unity, you also have a transform. Every game object in Unity has a transform. Instead of location, it's called position. Position, rotation, and scale. At the end of the day, position and location is exactly the same. And if we have to bring our objects from here into Unity, as a good example, they just translate the exact same way. All right, so whatever units we're using here is a unit in Unity. Curious, what's the scale of Unity? What units does Unity use in terms of measurement inside the scene? Do you guys know? Meters. What units are we using here? Blender units. Hey, I'm just putting it out to you because Blender units have nothing to do with meters, right? Which means your scale, when you bring this into Unity, is going to be completely off. To work with Unity, we have to modify our scale so that the scale we're using here is exactly the scale we're going to use in Unity. To do this, on the right, now we're moving away from our main viewport here. Our mouse is hovering to the right, which is over here, into this tab. Notice that there's a series of, if I click and drag this, there's a series of tabs across this particular panel, this panel right here. This is, think about this as the inspector. All right, here's my inspector or my properties panel. And you can see that there's a bunch of tabs here, right? In order for me to change my scale, I've got to go to this tab, the 3rd tab from the left. And notice on the bottom, it says under units, it says the unit presets. I want to click meters. On the top left, when you do that in your viewport, it'll show meters. If you don't do this, when you try and export something into Unity, your scale will be completely wrong. Okay, so please change your scale to meters by clicking this tab and changing this option. Notice also, like I did, I can drag my panels as big and small as I want. So I can change my default layout the way I like. Okay, we're going to talk about layouts later on. So again, I'm kind of orbiting around the scene, and I can select each of the cubes. Here's my cube. Notice that my cubes are not in the exact locations. I've got a cube that's 6.0099 meters by 1.986886 meters. Well, if I want to make them exact, I want to make this at 6 meters, and I want to put this exactly at 2 meters. Now it's in the exact position at 6 and 2. This one is at 6 and 6.0099 and 0. I can change this to 6. And I can go around and be very specific on how I want to make my cubes align with my scene. Okay, so I'm just clicking, right-clicking, and changing my values so that they're the exact numbers that I want. So they're not an approximate. It's not eyeballing anymore. I'm actually changing my values here in my location so I can put my cubes in the exact spot that I want. So here's my exact spots. So here you can see that these cubes are all off. These are negative numbers from the middle, -2. And I can change a bunch of them all at the same time. I can make so that these both are at -2, right? And if these are off, like for example, these are 3.9886, this one has to go to 4. Right, and this one has to go to 2, -2, and this one has to go to -2. So these should be all aligned, -2 and 4. This is 2. Let's make sure that's correct. There we go. And you can see now that they're more aligned, these cubes, than before, and they're not. I've not just eyeballed them, the position, but actually typing in values to make them exactly, to put them exactly where I want them to be, right? So again, -4 and 2, and -4 here, and 0. So you can see now that when I unclick this, by the way, deselecting all is the A key. Selecting all is the A key. So I can select all or deselect all by pressing the A key, toggling the A key on and off. And now I'm going to tumble around the scene. You can see that these things look like they're perfectly positioned as I made my wall. I haven't made it the whole grid like I asked you to do, but I've made it so that each of these objects are stacked exactly on top of each other. Okay? Notice also that I've got this grid, and the grid shows my cube that has a position of, in this particular case, the first cube that I have is 0, 0, 0. This is the cube that's in the center of my world, but it's cut in half by this grid, because it starts building from the middle of my cube up. That is the pivot point of my cube, something that we like to call the origin. So the origin of an object is usually the middle of the object. So if I click on this, right-click on this cube, and I hover in, you can see that it appears that the origin, or the pivot point of my object, the anchor, if you will, is in the middle of my object. If you want to change this, take a look on the left. You can see that there is another panel on the left called the transform panel. This transform panel has a bunch of, or this other panel on the left, has a bunch of different other options. Some of them are going to be available to you, some of them aren't, depending on what you've loaded in terms of plugins. What I can do, if you see set origin, I can set my origin to my geometry, which is what is set right now. I can also set it to the 3D cursor, wherever that is. I can set it to other things as well. Leave it right now as is. So far we've only been able to manipulate objects in the scene, okay? Like moving them around. And we've done that with either the G key, so G, I can press G and press the X axis, and I can move things exactly along the X axis. If I want to move them by a certain amount, take a look at the numeric transform here on the right, right? You can see the numeric transform panel up here, right, is actually showing you the exact translation. If I want to move on the X axis exactly 4, I can just press the 4 button, and now I'm 4 meters. If I press 6, I'm 46 meters. If I press backspace, I'm back to 4 meters. If I press backspace again, I'm at a -2 or whatever it was that I was at. And if I change this, I can actually change this to 1, 2, that's 12. Or if I press enter or left click, right, it'll accept the changes. So now it seems that my cube is offset with the rest of my wall. If I want to put it back, I can literally just go back here And notice where it says the X on the X-axis, it's 1. I can put it back to 0, and it can move back to where it is. So numerically, I can transform my cube in terms of position anywhere I want. All right, here's another thing I can do. I can also scale and rotate my cube. Those are 2 things I can do. The hotkey for scaling is S, the S key. If I click S, I can scale my cube bigger than normal. Okay, there's my S key. And notice what it says on the numeric transform. It says my scale is 1.848 times larger. And I can go through here, and I can, if I click this little, these little buttons, I can limit my scaling. I can anchor my scale, or I can just change them to whatever size I want numerically. So I can say I want to scale exactly by 2, or I want to scale exactly by 1.5. And I don't have to make it a uniform scale. I can change the objects so that they're not uniformly scaled if I don't. Okay, I can also make the scale. So if I choose another cube here, and if I choose S for scale, and I can only choose along one axis, along the X-axis, so S, and then X, and then exactly 2, I can make it so that I can scale my cube across the X-axis 2 times. S, X, 2, all at once, all in a sequence. Okay. Again, let's do the same thing for the middle one. I want to scale my object across the Z-axis by 3. S, Z, 3. You can see now that there's this cube is scaled across the Z-axis 3 times. And I can accept my changes by pressing the Enter key or left-clicking. All right, so that's kind of something you can do with your cubes. You can S for scale, G for move. And here's the last one, rotation. What do you think the rotation key is going to be? S for scale, G for move. R is a pretty good guess, right? So, okay, I want to take my cube, my big one over here. I'm going to right-click it to select it. I'm going to press R for rotate, and I can rotate it in any direction I want. Notice there's this little line here. See a little line? It's almost like I'm casting a line. And no matter what I'm doing, I've got an arc that I'm moving my line around, okay? But this is kind of random. I usually want to rotate it across a particular axis. So again, R for rotate across the X-axis, and now I'm rotating it across one axis, across the Z-axis, across the Y-axis, right? And you can rotate your objects any way you like. And now it's a random number, but I can specify angle in degrees. And notice if you notice over here on this panel near here, near my cursor, you can see that it's negative 293. I can specify a number, like for example, negative 90. That's exactly a number. Or negative, if I put negative, it'll keep on adding. I can backspace. I can also just accept it and change it here numerically by going in here, left-clicking in here, and just saying negative 90. Negative 90. There we go. And that will be exactly negative 90. Right? If I want to, and you can't see it. If I say negative 45, right? Then it'll change to exactly 45 degrees, rotated across the Y-axis, 45 degrees. If I want to rotate it across the X-axis 45 degrees as well, I can just go here and put negative 45. Or I can go to 45. It'll look the same, right? What about if I want to change on my Z-axis 30 degrees? Let's just put 30. And now you can see that the cube has been rotated across both the X, Y, and Z axis in a non-uniform fashion. Okay? So rotation is R, scale is S, and G is move. Those 3 hotkeys you need to know. Okay, one more thing. You can do all that, if you want to, all that by these little hotkeys down here on the bottom of your screen. So outside of the viewport on the bottom, there's these little arrows. There's an arrow. There's also this thing that looks like an arc, right, that brings up this thing. It looks like the manipulator now has changed, so you can rotate across different axes, right, by pressing this little arc. It looks like an arc on the bottom of your screen. If I press this little arm with a cube at the end, it allows me to scale my object in one direction or across one axis, right, according to where I've pressed my manipulator. So I can scale across the Z-axis. I can scale across the Y-axis. Right? So one axis, which is kind of cool. All right, so that's what I can do with my cubes. Okay, challenge. I want you to create a spaceship with your primitive objects by positioning cubes and cones and primitives across your scene. So move your cones and primitives and everything's across your scene and make a very simple spaceship, like building Lego bricks, using Lego bricks to build a spaceship. Go, do it. Make a little spaceship with primitives. If you have to restart your scene, just press Control-N to restart and put your spaceship in order. All right, so all I want you to use cubes, your primitives, to build a scene or an object that looks like a spaceship. Okay? I'm going to let you do that for a few minutes while I talk. One thing to note is the things that we've been doing right now is we've been working in something called object mode. Object mode allows us to create primitive objects and manipulate primitive objects and move them around in our scene. Our scene, the thing that you're seeing all these objects that are sitting in, is a container that is basically a game world. This scene right here, it's massive. It's as big as your computer can handle, all right? Right now, the only thing that's being rendered in the scene in our viewport is the thing that we can see. Anything that we can't see outside of our scene is being culled. It's being not drawn, okay? So our 3D application keeps our objects in our scene even if we can't see them, but only draws the stuff to the scene that we can see. Okay, this is a good use of memory management for a computer. Otherwise, what's going to end up happening is, imagine if I had to physically draw everything, and keep them physically drawn in memory, it'd be really hard on the GPU. Now I'm using a very simple laptop. I'm using a Dell laptop. It's not a gaming laptop. It doesn't have a really cool GPU. I do have I believe an NVIDIA GPU. I don't think I have an AMD GPU, right? My NVIDIA chipset is like 2 gigs of kind of video RAM, which is okay. But typically when we do this kind of 3D application stuff, you want a chipset in your that has at least, let's say, 4 gigs of RAM, right? If you're going to be a gamer, you should look for something that has at least, your GPU should have at least 6 gigs of RAM to get the best performance, all right? Going towards 8 gigs and 12 gigs are even better, but very expensive. So for example, if you have an NVIDIA 1080 Ti or the new I think the 2080s that have just come out, you're going to be really good, but it's going to cost you a couple $1,000 for everything, right? Here, though, we can get along with using Blender on a very simple machine, which to me is really cool. I'm just going to close down some of these other applications to give myself some more memory. All right, who's finished their spaceship? Anybody? No? Remember, you can scale, so I can do things like this. I can take my basic object here and scale across the z-axis, so I can make it flat. So I want to make my spaceship kind of flat. I can scale across the x-axis and make kind of wings like this, right? I can duplicate this, Shift D across the z-axis, or sorry, across the y-axis. Let's say 2 units, right? There we go. So I can make it this way. I can scale across the x-axis, some units. So I can kind of start formulating what my object is going to look like, right? I'm blocking out my object, just like we did when we were drawing, right? And again, I can duplicate, Shift D across the y-axis, 2 units, right? And then I can press R across the x-axis, right? Rotate. I don't want to rotate. I want to press S across the x-axis. There we go. I want to scale that in there. Okay, so I've got my basics for my ship, right? And then I can start duplicating, right? I can Shift right-click on all these objects, and I can press Shift D, right? I can duplicate this across the z-axis, 2 units. So there's my 2 units. So I can see that I have objects that are looking like this, right? And then I can rotate across the x-axis, right, until I have what I want. And then I can use my manipulator arm to pull these objects together until I have the look and feel of what my spaceship is going to look like. I remember I didn't give you limitations, so you can make your spaceship look like whatever you want. I'm making it look more wedge-like, I can also Shift A to add in additional objects like cubes, which I can move up. There's my cube for my spaceship. Here's something that's happening. Look at this. You see this part? That's called Zed Fighting. So Zed Fighting is when the computer's trying to draw two objects on top of each other, and it doesn't know which one to draw first, right? So I'm going to scale this across the Z-axis, right, only. So I kind of bring my cube in. I kind of make my spaceship. I want to scale it across the X-axis. So I kind of make this cube look like this. I want to rotate it across the X-axis. So I get something that looks approximately what I want, and then move it across. It's going to be a very different looking kind of spaceship that I'm making. I'm also going to get Shift A and add a sphere. Let's make it an icosphere instead, right? Which is kind of a different looking sphere. And put this in here for my cockpit and scale it. There we go. So I got my cockpit looking thing. And then I want to kind of add some other objects to my spaceship, so make it look different. So maybe, and again, I'm limiting you to this right now. That's why it looks so blocky. We're going to get out of the blockiness in a bit. So again, I'm going to Shift A and add in a maybe some cylinders. There we go. And I'm going to rotate them across the X-axis 90 degrees. There we go. And I'm going to pull these cylinders up and scale them down a little bit and pull them out a little bit and move them across so I can make my spaceship have some engines. Right, there we go. And I'm going to duplicate this across the X-axis. So let's say, make my spaceship look like this. There you go. Very blocky spaceship, that's for sure. You can also do things like, I want to kind of duplicate both things. So Shift D for duplicate, and then at the same time, after duplicating, scale them immediately. Scale, so I kind of bring them in, right, and then move them out. Right, there we go. And maybe what you want to do here is, after you scale it, you can duplicate them again. So Shift D, right, and I want to rotate across the Y-axis. So I want to kind of rotate these ones here. Kind of create a conflagration of engines for my spaceship. There we go. I'm telling you, it's like Lego. And then if I want to move these ones kind of to the middle, so I want to move this engine here, maybe move this engine just by eye. I want to move it over here. I'm just kind of eyeballing it again. Okay, there we go. So spaceship with a lot of engines. And maybe add some more blocks. So again, I'm going to put my right click on this block here. And I want to press Shift A to add in another cube, which is right here. Bring that up and make it flat. So I want to scale across the Y-axis. Actually, let's make it across the X-axis instead. And pull that out. So kind of make a side for my spaceship. Right, very good. Maybe make it so that it is scaled across the Y-axis now a bunch of ways, and scaled across the Z-axis so that it's kind of compact. Move this down and move it across. It's like Lego, like I said. You can make kind of like this little spaceship here. Right? And we'll scale it. So we'll duplicate on the other side. So we'll Shift D across the X-axis. Place it just in a temporary spot there and move it so that by eye it looks somewhat similar. And now what we'll do is we'll Shift D and across the which duplicates across the Y-axis, right? So make some kind of guns. And what we'll do is we'll shift, we'll scale across the Z-axis, so the guns are kind of smaller, and we'll pull these guns in. There we go. They have our spaceship. Again, looking very block-like right now, right? Because that's what I've allowed you guys to do. I'm also going to Shift D, right, across the X-axis, right? So I'm making these pop out. Actually, let's undo that change. You can always press escape if you don't want to accept them. I have extra blocks though. Once you press Shift D, you have these extra blocks. There's nothing you can do about it, right? And let's just do the same thing with this one. There we go. So kind of the same, but not. They're not exactly. If I really want to be numeric, I can. I'm not going to do that here. But what I want to do is I want to scale these things by Shift right clicking. Scale across the Z axis so that they're very thin. There we go, or thinner. And then what I want to do is I want to pull them up. And let's say we'll rotate them across the y-axis. That's pretty cool. We'll make them over here like this, maybe by 90 degrees. There we go. Okay, and this, what I want to do is singly pull these down. So kind of put some kind of thing in my ship that looks like this. Move that up. So again, so I'm asking you to do this stuff because I want you to understand how to use the basic primitives and the navigation tools in Blender to create basic primitive objects and block out your scene, which is what I've been doing. All right, you should pretty much have at least what I have now. All right, like all I've done is just use my primitive tools to move things around. I wasn't even that creative, but you can see that there's limitations with what we can do here. Okay, because I'm using primitive tools, I'm scaling them, and I'm not saying you can do anything else. Anyone have anything cool to show before I move on? Let's take a look. I'll be right back. I'm going to keep recording though. Okay, it looks like 3 bullets. More than anything else. Okay, it looks like some kind of weird alien spaceship.
One quick question. How do you select only this part? Just want to select
part.
Just this one.
Okay, so Shift right click the other one. Shift right click that part. Shift. How you get it again?
Oh, this part, right?
Yeah, the whole part. Or just that part, or the cone as well.
No, just the entire part.
Yeah, so you click right click the first part and Shift right click the second part to select everything. Okay, try moving that around. So try press the G key or move it around to. So undo, press escape. So Shift right click the other part. Shift right click. Good. And Shift right click that part. Good. Now press G. Okay, and you can use numeric transforms that way too. Okay, so kind of very primitive shapes. You know, you can be, of course, very creative here or not. It's up to you. I was kind of in the not category, but that's fine. But the idea here is that you can make whatever object you want. Okay, I'm going to start a new scene. This is just some practice for you guys to move things around. Okay. So again, Control N to start a new scene. I'm back to normal. I've got my primitive. All right. Things that we've done so far is we've made things rotate and translate and scale. We've moved them all around the scene, and we've used basic primitives. But that really gives us limitations into the creativity that we can have just using this stuff. Okay. So let's do the next set of transformations. So with a cube, you might say that there's not a lot we can do. But right now, we've been operating something called object mode. I want to move into something called edit mode. All right. And to do that, please press the Tab key now. When I do this, I'm now in edit mode. Notice this little area right here. It tells you the mode we're in. It says edit mode. If I go back to the center of my viewport and I press Tab again, I'm back in object mode. Edit mode, object mode, edit mode, object mode. When I click edit mode, the left menu changes, the left panel. Watch. Edit mode, changes, object mode, changes. Edit mode. Okay, in edit mode now, what I'm actually doing is, I'm just going to tell you this so you understand what's happening here. I'm actually inside the container of the cube object. Okay, so the cube is just a name for a game object. I want you to think of it like this. that has a cube primitive inside of it. Okay? So when I press tab, I'm actually editing the container that is the cube. It's a local space that I'm changing. Okay? I'm not affecting the other outside world, just the cube container. So all the other objects in my scene are not being edited, just that cube. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Notice that everything seems to be orange, right? Or this orangey color. That's because my cube is completely selected. For me to deselect my cube, I'm going to press the A key now. Okay, now I'm inside editing mode and nothing is selected. So, curious, does anyone know the three main parts of all polygonal objects? Could you think about what, there's three types of things that all polygonal objects have. Excellent. Vertex, edges, and one more. You're on the right track. Huh? Faces. Vertices, edges, and faces. Okay. In edit mode, by default, I am in vertex select mode. So that means that if I right-click on a vertex, which is one of these little these little points right here, I right-click, you can see that now only that edge is selected. If I use my manipulator arm and use this, I can actually deform my cube now any way I like. Okay, here I can deform my cube like this. I can deform my cube now any way I like by selecting this one edge. And I can press the G key to freely transform my object, or I can use any one of these manipulator arms. Okay, I can also do things by shift right-clicking. So if I shift right-click, I actually can select both of these vertices at the same time. In effect, what I'm doing is I'm changing the entire edge at the same time. Okay. Now, sometimes it's useful to be in vertex select mode, but other times it's useful to be in edge select mode. So to go to edge select mode, you press Control Tab, which gives you a little menu that allows you to choose between vertex, edge, and face select mode. Let's go to edge select mode by pressing Control Tab and then clicking this little button. So Control Tab and pressing this little button. Okay. By the way, on the bottom, right? There's always ways to do things with these little buttons here. Notice that in the middle, we're also showing that we're in edge select mode right here. All right. If I want to click vertex select mode, I can select it here, or I can just choose edge select mode or face select mode down here, these little buttons. Right now, I only want to select edges though. So I want to select this edge and I want to select this edge, shift right click. And then all I can do is I can actually make this entire cube change size, right? But I can only make it so that only one edge is selected, or only the other edge is selected, or I can make it so that I can completely deform my object, right, to make it look like whatever I want. Control Tab, back into vertex select mode, and I can change one vertex at a time. Sometimes, though, it's really important to select a whole face. So Control Tab, go back into face select mode, and right-click on the face so that I can make it go up and down. So the whole face changes. I can kind of basically pull out or pull in an entire face. So this was my cube. Now, does it look like a cube anymore? No. All right. I want to go back into object mode. If I press Tab, I'm in object mode. And this is what my object looks like. Okay. Exercise 2. Exercise 2. Make your spaceship again, now knowing that you can go into edit mode and modify your edges, your faces, and your vertices. Go. You can do that. So you can have as many objects as you want, but you can modify all of those options. Edges, vertices, and faces. Make your spaceship again. So knowing that, wow, I have a lot of power now, right? So I'm going to start my scene again. And I'm going to go into this cube, and I'm going to basically click Tab to go into edit mode, press A to deselect everything. And now I know what I want. I want to kind of go into, I want to make my spaceship kind of angular. So I'm going to press Control Tab to go into edge select mode, select this edge, pull it all the way down to here. And then I'm going to select this edge and pull this all the way down to here. This is the first part of my design for my spaceship. Okay, so maybe make it even a little bit angry looking. Here's something that you can also do in edit mode. You can also select two edges like this So shift right click these two edges. And then if I press S for scale, the scaling works too. S for scale, it allows me to scale my edges in. So I can kind of create this pointed area really quickly, right? All right, there's my pointed area. Okay, but I mean, again, I'm still limiting you. There's still some things you don't know how to do yet, which I'm going to show you in a bit. So please just use your primitives. Let's go back to edit mode. There we go. Or object mode. And I'm going to add another cube. So Shift A. I'm going to add in another cube and move this over again. And it's pretty close to the other one. And I'm going to go into edit mode. And I'm going to just scale both these things down to make my ship look more realistic now. And maybe I want to make my back two edges, this whole edge here, I want to make this kind of taper in a little bit. So the front of my ship has a bit of a nose. And back into object mode, I'm going to Shift D to select this one and duplicate it across the Y-axis. All right, here we go. And I want to rotate across the Z-axis 180 degrees. So now I have the exact same object, but it has a bit of a bump that looks like this. So kind of cool. Again, I'm just eyeballing it here. You can certainly do this numerically, but I'm just trying to make an interesting looking spaceship with wings maybe and a body. This is the fuselage right now. And let's make it so that the back of this ship looks a little different than this. So again, I'm going to Shift D and duplicate it. I'm going to move it across the Y-axis here, right? So it's kind of something like this, right? There we go. And then I'm going to rotate this one. So rotate across the Z-axis 180 degrees so that it connects with this one. And we have kind of a body that's connected with the other one. So again, different primitive shapes. Okay, that's the objects that we have. Let's add in a Shift A to add another cube. And I'm going to scale across the Z-axis. Right, so create this smaller wing-like structure. So first I'm going to scale sometimes outside of edit mode, right? And then I kind of scale inside of edit mode across the X. I'm scaling again to create my wings, my wingspan. So I've kind of done proportional scaling now so that it looks more like an object that I want. Now I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. And what I want to do is press A to deselect all, hit this back wing and kind of increase the wingspan there. Maybe increase the angle that we got there, right? And what I want to try and do is just select these outer edges. Right here is outer edges, and I want to press scale. So scale only across the Z-axis to kind of make those edges kind of come in a little bit more. I think they need to come in just a touch more. That's good. Deselect all, and then kind of go in here and select these vertices. So these verts. So Control Tab, go click these verts. So this vert and this vert, and maybe just pan around the orbit around the ship and get into this vert and this vert. So I'm just selecting these four vertices. And now what I want to do is scale in, right, so that they scale towards the middle of the ship. Right, so I kind of got an angle to the ship, a little better than before. Right, there we go. And again, not showing you anything else but primitive scaling is pretty cool. I'm not sure if I like this whole wing. So back into object mode and scale the thing across the X-axis a little more so you can kind of scale it in. Right, and maybe what I want to do is I want to make it so that there's a series of wings. So maybe what I want to do is Shift D for duplicate across the Z-axis, kind of move it up like this. So this is almost like a bi-wing kind of spaceship. And maybe what I want to do is rotate the wing, across the, maybe across the X-axis a little bit. So kind of have a wing that's kind of folded in. And same thing with this one, rotate across the X-axis. So kind of make the wing kind of go like this, kind of similar to my first design. Maybe I want to bring these a little closer. So I want to kind of bring these down Again, we're just playing just like Lego. But again, we find that there's limitations that we have, right? I'm not allowing you to do certain things that'll even help you even more with this. But you see, we started with primitive shapes, just cubes, right? And I've modified things. Let's add a sphere. So Shift A to add a new sphere. Let's use a UV sphere this time, as opposed to what I added before. And let's scale that completely so it's a little bit smaller. So I have a little bit of a cockpit or a control center. Let's say right there. And one object is inside the other, which is going to cause problems later on, but hey, we don't care. I'm going to Shift A and add a new cube again. And what I want to do is I want to pull this cube over here somewhere in the back, scale it across the x-axis so that it is a little bit thinner. There we go. Maybe that's too thin. Scale across the x-axis again. No. Now tab into edit mode. And what I want to do is get this thing looking a little smoother. So deselect all by pressing the A key. Grab these 2 points here and scale them in, right? And that's pretty cool. And I also want to move them back, right? And same thing with these ones. Let's move these ones back. And scale them down a little bit. Maybe scale these down. Or just move them down. There we go. You have a little ship that looks a lot better than before, right? Still though, there's not, we've missed some stuff. There's my ship. What does your ship look like? So that's pretty quick. This is blocking out my objects really quickly to make your spaceship. Are you with me? Are you comfortable? Is there any questions that you guys have so far? Because we're going to move into something more complex in a second. All right, so far we've learned how to navigate in Blender. We've learned how to move things around by pressing the G key for translate or right-clicking and dragging. We've also learned how to go from object mode to edit mode, and we've described that edit mode is like editing the container that is the object itself, and inside that object container there is a primitive object called a cube or a sphere or whatever it is. One thing to note, on the top right of the scene, take a look, guys. On the top right, see this? This is the object outliner. I'm going to kind of pull this down for a second so you can see it. So this is all the objects that I have in my scene. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cubes that I made to do this, and 1 sphere. That's what I use to make this shape. 7 cubes and a sphere. All right? So the outliner, you can use the outliner on the right-hand side here, guys, to also select your objects with left-clicking. So for example, and I can also rename my objects. So if I tab into object mode, here's my object mode. And if I want to rename my cube, this cube here, to the tail, right? And if I want to say that this one is the top wing, so here's top wing, I can just double-click. And this one is the bottom wing. There's the bottom wing. And this one is the front fuselage. So front fuselage, right? And this is the main body. These 3 things are all the main body. I can do that. So I say like main body. And so is this one. And if I give it the same name, it'll actually name it like 001, right? That's what it's done. So it's main body 002, right? So pretty cool. And this is sphere. This will be the cockpit. All I've done is rename my objects in the outliner so they're closer to what my objects are here. Okay. By the way, anything you name your objects in the outliner, when you take this object into Unity, it'll preserve your naming convention, right? Whatever you called them in the outliner. Okay. Now I have several objects here that are all one shape. I've created a shape that's the spaceship, but there's different objects that I made. If I want to combine all these shapes into one shape that I can edit all together, note, danger, to do what I'm doing right now. This is not what we're going to do in the future, but let's just do it anyway. If I want to combine shapes, I can choose a shape like the cockpit. So here's the cockpit first. And I can shift right click all the other shapes like this. So shift right click, right? Now all the other shapes are selected. And if I press, by the way, if you don't remember how to do it, I think it's Control J. It joined everything into one. And the last thing I chose, which is the bottom wing, is what the thing is called now. But if I choose to go in there and double click and say ship, now my ship is one object. And I can move it around together, okay? If that makes sense. This is my spaceship. And if I press tab to enter, to edit, now I'm editing everything else. Notice one thing though, each of the objects in the editor, right? So they're separate objects. And I also have some really weird things happening. So Control Tab, move into edge select mode. I can select this edge, but all these other edges are selected. And I can't shift right click to select these objects anymore because they're one big object. However, if I press Control L, it'll select everything inside of in the editor that is connected to this one object. So if I right click this and I press Control L, it's only this object. I want to right click over here and Control L, it's only this object. So I have actual controls inside the object. Now, one thing to note, if I open up my ship, it's only one big container now. It's not a cube anymore. It's a ship. And inside my ship, I have one cube. That's all it is. That's this whole thing. This is like, it's looking at this whole thing as one big shape. And guys, this is where we have issues. Why? Because look at this. My sphere, if I press Control L, is inside my other shape over here, right? It's inside of it. So how is this thing going to be rendered, right? I mean, it's going to be almost overlapping, right, in my object. If I want to see my object in wireframe mode, this is something that I frequently do. I press the Z key. This is wireframe mode, where I can actually ghost all the other objects that I'm seeing, and I can see just the shapes of the objects in wireframes. You can see now, if I just click away here, that this sphere is inside of the other object here, like this. Okay? So Z key allows me to go from solid mode to wireframe mode. And this is great from a visualization perspective to understand what's happening. Okay? All right. So some things we talked about is combining objects by pressing Control J to join. But if you forgot, right? If I want to split an object away now, let's say I want to take my cockpit, so I press right click on one of the edges. So one of the edges I've selected, and then I press Control L. So I've selected the whole sphere that's part of the same sphere, and I want to split this thing, right? And if I don't remember how to do it, I can press space and I can type in split, right? And you can see that it says mesh split, which is the Y key. Gives you the hot shortcut key right here too. And then it's going to say, cool, so this is, I want to split this into different parts. Let me just undo that. I can't undo. View, undo, Control Z does not work for me. But let's suppose, see if my other Control Z works. It does. My other control key. For my left control key, it don't worky. On my right control key, she works fine, right? Yay, so I'll be right clicking. So yeah, so I want to separate is what I want to do. Sorry, not split. So if I want to separate, here it is. It's P for separate, the P key. And when I click it and I want to separate the selection, now that object in the outliner is a separate object again. If I press tab to go into object mode, I can select that object and I can bring it up. But guess what? Look what's happened. My selector, my arm is way out here and my object is way down here. How come? It grouped it together and then the origin went to the center of that whole big object. And when I separate it out, my origin remained. It's way over there. So what I want to do is I want to set the origin to the object. And to do that, on the left, you can see that there's set origin. And I can set origin to geometry. When I do that, boom, my little manipulator arm goes to the middle again. This is very important because that's where the pivot would be as well. But let me just Control Z that. So if I want to Control Z, maybe it doesn't work. It My tools are just not working. Yeah, let's just do it again. Okay, I press undo. Let's do it. I do it randomly like this. There we go. Undo. Maybe I can't undo the object origin stuff, but it doesn't look like it's working. Anyway, so if you notice that here, what's happening is I have my object and it's separate. Okay, and that's really cool, but that's the first part that I wanted to show you. Okay, we're almost out of time, but I want to show you one more thing. I'm going to start a brand new project, right? We did so far a couple of spaceships, and for homework, what I'm going to get you to do in Blender is I want to make you build a spaceship in Blender. Take your time, right? And build your spaceship in Blender, knowing the tools that I've given you. Make it as accurate as you can, okay? As best as you can. Don't worry about if it's perfect. I don't expect you to do a perfect spaceship. Make it out of your imagination. And I want you to upload the a screenshot of the image in 3/4 view, like maybe like something like this, onto our discussion board, which I'm going to make, okay? All right, so how do we do this? One more thing. So I'm going to press Control-N, start a brand new project. And I want to show you one more thing that you can do with your cubes. I want to press Tab to go into edit mode. And on the left, there's a very useful tool that we can use called Subdivide. Now watch this. This is very important to see, please, guys. So please pay attention. Same thing with you, Philip. Take a look for a second. So I'm in edit mode, and I want to press Subdivide on the left. It allows me to subdivide my cube into more pieces. Notice the number of cuts on the left. I can choose a number of cuts to make my cube more detailed. If I press A now, I have a series of smaller subdivisions that I can use. And why is this important? Well, because I can do something like this, where I can select only the vertices that I want. And then let's say, for example, I want to round out my cube. I can do something like scale, and I can do something like this. I can round out my cube. I can modify object parts of my cube. Control-Tab to go into faces. So I can kind of select some of my faces, pull them out, make my object a little bit more detailed, right, by making multiple selections, scaling, right? So I can make my object seem a little bit more interesting now. And one more tool that I want you guys to know is something called the Extrude Tool. Okay, this is going to help you do everything you need. Okay, watch. If I click some faces here, so these faces here in the front, and I click, let's say, I'll make all of them selected. If I press E for extrude, and if I press enter, I can actually extrude more geometry, right? And if I press S to scale now, I can change my geometry so it's even better, right? I'm even closer to what I want. I can press E for extrude, right? And then I can select my faces around, right? By the way, if you press Control-Alt and right-click, you'll select all the faces in an area, right? Like I just did. So let me show you this. So let's say I do that. So again, I've got my face selected, and if I press Control-Alt and then right-click, selects all the faces around, right? And then what I can do is I can extrude, right? And press Enter, and then scale and make them bigger. So I can make whatever object I want, extrude, and then scale, and then scale in if I want. And I can extrude different pieces of it, you know, until I have whatever weird shape I want, right? So this is something that you can do by extruding and subdividing. So I subdivide my cube into smaller pieces. I press E for extrude, and I can extrude out different parts of my ship now. So now I can make my ship with one cube, okay, completely. So let's show you that again. So I'm going to, again, Control-N for starting over again. Control-N, right? I go Tab in, Subdivide surface, subdivide over here on the left, right? I can make as many cuts as I want. I can also subdivide again. I can just click Subdivide one more time. But on the left, you can see that there's an option to increase the number of cuts I want. I can do straight cuts. I can also do fans, paths, different kinds of cuts. For now, I just want to do straight cuts. And if I subdivide one more time, right, you can see that I have a lot of control. But now I have many, many more faces. The more faces, the more polygons. So-called, if we have a character or an object that's a lot of polygons, we call it high poly. Like, for example, 1,000,000 of these things, right? If we have a low polygon shape, like not many polygons, we call it low poly, right? Usually in games we want low poly meshes. Why? This is a mesh, this thing. Why? Because the higher number of polygons, the more faces, edges, and vertices, the more computationally expensive it is for the computer to run. Okay? So if I deselect all, and if I want to make my spaceship now, let's say, for example, I want to start with my face selection. So let's say face selection. And you can tell that it's face select because it has a little dot in the middle. Right? I don't have to extrude yet. I can just pull it out like this. This is part of my my object. I'm just blocking out my my object first. So I want to make my fuselage first this time around. Right? So I'm going to press E to extrude and enter this time right away, and then pull that out. Right? So I can pull up my my fuselage the way I want. Also, what I can do is I can soften these edges up. I can press edge select mode, select only the edges that I want, right? And then press S to scale, and I can scale them in, right? So they're kind of more rounded. And what I could do is, I can press face select mode, select only the faces that I want. Let's maybe just these ones. And what you could do is, actually, let's do it in a different way. I'll go to vertex select mode and only select these verts, right? And then press S to scale. It's kind of making more of a rounded shape, right? And then I'll go into face select mode and select these ones, and then press E to extrude and E to extrude enter, and kind of pull out my spaceship, almost like a rocket now. And then S to scale, so I can kind of put it at a point if I want. All right, so kind of more of an interesting kind of ship. If I want to really go crazy with edges, so just all these edges, I want them to pull back. I can still do the same thing that I normally do with edges. But you can see the kind of level of control that I have here now with my subdivisions, right? And it looks like a box still, but I can make wings, so I can go control, kind of go to faces and separate out my wings. Let's say make them down like this, up to here this time around. And if I want to select a series of edges, faces like this, again, I can press Control, right? Control Alt right click, which selects all those faces all at the same time. And I can deselect stuff by just right clicking again. So Shift right click deselects the parts I don't want. So I don't want all this stuff, right? I don't want all this stuff. But careful, there's some objects that you haven't seen that are inside this. If I go into Zed mode, you can see that I've also selected this little face right here, right? That you can't see. There's a small face that I created by accident somehow. And what you want to do is make sure you deselect those faces if you're going to do what I'm going to do. Okay, now what I can do is I can scale it out. So scale, right? And then scale across the Z axis. All right, there we go. To start doing my ship the way I want it. And again, you block out your object the way you like until you have the shape that you want. And again, the thing I like to say is it's never good enough until it is, right? What you can do now is you can extrude, and I can grab some of these faces here and maybe these faces here and extrude. Now, if I grab it this way, it'll actually pull some faces in and pull some faces out, right? So maybe what I want to do, Control Z actually worked. I don't know how, but if I only want to pull these faces out, now I can just pull them out. And same thing with these ones. I can be more specific, more exact. I want to pull these out. And I have a weird shape happening here because I selected more faces on one side than I did on the other side. Let's Control Z all that stuff. How far it'll let me go. By the way, really good practice for this one is to make sure. I know what I did. See, I didn't select. I selected this one, but not this one. Did that? So there you go. So yeah. So what you want to do, scale across the Z-axis. What you want to do is make sure that you can have your selections are you're able to undo a number of times, and you can find that, which we'll talk about more next week, in the preferences area, right? So extrude, and all I'm doing is just going around my ship and selecting primitive shapes right now. Again, you might say this is kind of neat, but there's so much more you can do here with your tools and the tools I've just given you. You just have to be creative. Okay, so you can start making your ship out. And if I don't like any of this stuff, you can also delete faces and edges. Be careful when you do that. It'll leave holes. So if I say, well, I don't want any of these ones. So I said, I don't know. I don't want this whole, these whole parts right here somehow. I don't know why. I don't want them, right? Then I can press X and I can just delete the faces. And you can see now that there's a hole in my ship, right? Because this is just a mesh. It's kind of connected. Let's undo that. I can also press these in to give it a different shape, right? So I got kind of an interesting shape there. And what does this look like in object mode? It looks kind of like this. And I made it's one cube, right? So take your time when you do this at home. Play around with the tools. I want you to use these tools. There's some really cool selection tools as well that I should tell you about before I let you go. I know we're running late. We have 2 more minutes before everyone else comes in. And then I'm also recording, which is cool, so you can always go back. But the selection tools that you might want to use in edit mode, for example, I want to select all the entire front right away. I can go into wireframe mode, right? And in wireframe mode, I only want these parts to be selected, but not these parts. And I want to do it all at once. I can press the B key for box select, and I can just select those pieces. And then what I'll do is it'll select those, right? If I want to be even more careful, we're going to talk about this later on, I can look at different views. The right number pad on your keyboard allows you to move your, if you don't have a number pad, by the way, that's what happens when you have a laptop. Mine does. But if I press the 1 key on my numeric keypad, it goes to front view. The 2 key, right, is user perspective. 3 key goes to right view. 7 key goes to top view, right? And so on. That's user perspective for 4 and 6. 5 goes to orthographic view, so it's completely flat, right? So sometimes what I want to do is I want to select things in orthographic view with the 5 key. Deselect all, again. Press the B key, so B select mode. Only select the faces that I want. There we go. There's my faces. And that's only those faces, but nothing else. And I press back into Z select mode for my solid mode. And then I can just scale that part out, right? Or I can, I can extrude that part out, right? As an example. And same thing if I go back to 3, which is the right ortho, or 1, which is the front ortho. And then if I move it out and I want to, do something else over here. So I can press Z. I only want to deselect all. I want to just select this part of my ship, right? So I want to use B for box select and just select this for this first part. So just the front. Very interesting, right? And what I can do is I can pull these back, shrink them down, right? Do whatever I want to do, right? And so it makes it closer to what I'm looking for, right? Or scale across the y-axis. I don't know. So kind of make it so it's a little thinner in the front, to make my ship look different, a lot different than I expected. Maybe not the one what I want. That's kind of weird looking. And what if I don't want some pieces of the ship? I can just get rid of it, right? Or I can start over. So again, your job when you go home after today is for next week, try and produce something just for participation marks. Try and produce something with Blender It'll be a good chance for you to learn the interface, move things around, and make a spaceship with all the tools I've just given you, okay? Any kind of spaceship you like. If you want to use a reference, but I want it to be your own. I want to see what you can do with Blender, because your final test in this course is going to need Blender, one way or the other, okay? And that's it for me for today. That's a lot.